All right, everybody. We're going to start again, this time with Dale Kronkright. He is the head of conservation at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, where he's worked since its inception in 1997. His research into O'Keeffe studio materials and techniques in collaboration with scientists and conservators at the National Gallery of Art resulted in the 2006 exhibition and catalog Color and Conservation, which documented the 40-year relationship between Caroline Keck and Georgia O'Keeffe. Dale was a great help in my research into O'Keeffe's working methods, which he will share with you this evening. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you, all of you who have stayed around for the first part and the intermission. You are truly the dedicated, the self-selected, and I appreciate you all being here. I'm a conservator, as you heard, and I spend my career looking at art, and in particular, for the past 27 years, looking at the art of Georgia O'Keeffe. Everything, including art, has a finite lifetime, and everything deteriorates all the time. There should be no news to any of us here. Conservators and engineers know this as the fatigue model of deterioration. Every object starts out with a finite number of molecular bonds. They give it color, they give it shape, they give it weight, and other characteristics. Think of this group of molecular bonds as the gas tank that every work of art contains. And every energy input, such as light, humidity, vibration, shock, all speed up the rate at which those molecular bonds get broken. So every time a molecule breaks, didn't know you were coming to a chemistry lesson, I'm sure. Every time a molecule breaks, the job of holding that object together gets transferred to a smaller and smaller number of remaining molecules, which fall apart at an ever faster rate. My job is to make that gas tank last as long as possible by preventing the energy inputs that speed the deterioration. Of course, when enough of the molecules holding an object, a work of art together, break, we see visible damage. A crack in the paint, the yellowing of paper, the fading of a watercolor, a tear in a drawing, those are all results of those molecular breaks. So when that happens, conservators like me have to add new materials to the work of art to do the job that the broken molecules used to do. And to do that carefully and in a way that actually slows the overall rate of deterioration, conservators have to know rather precisely what the original materials are and how the artist used them. The result of this process is that conservators discover and document a deep and nuanced understanding of how an artist makes an original work of art. At the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, we now have 25 years of scientific documentation about O'Keeffe's artistic decisions, the materials and techniques that she decided to discard, the materials and techniques that she decided to keep, and those she experimented with and when. So each of these documented elements represent the tangible evidence of intentional decisions by Georgia O'Keeffe about what she wanted to communicate visually through her artwork. Through her drawing and painting practice, Georgia O'Keeffe interrogated the world for its most compelling experiences. In response to that interrogation, O'Keeffe attempted to create works of art that were real living forms in their own right, to use her words. Works that could trigger an extended conversation with you, the viewer. O'Keeffe hoped to create the undiscovered from her interrogation of the commonplace. In the summer of 1923, O'Keeffe wrote to her friend, the writer Sherwood Anderson, describing this process of material interrogation, of painting to get to the meaning of things. O'Keeffe said, "I feel that a real living form is the result of an individual's effort to create the living thing out of the adventure of his spirit into the unknown, where it has experienced something it's not understood." She continued, "Making your unknown known is the important thing, and then keeping the unknown always beyond you, catching, crystallizing your simpler, clearer vision of life, only then to see it turn stale compared to what you vaguely feel coming ahead." Today, using paintings from the O'Keeffe and Moore exhibition here in San Diego, I'm going to illustrate some of the techniques that O'Keeffe used to get to this meaning of things through the process of painting. There we go. Okay, so let me first list some of the techniques for you that we're about to see and visit. The first is the selection of the most compelling forms and colors in any setting she's come across. The second is the elimination of unnecessary detail that seems to distract your attention from what she feels is the most important part. Third, a composition that confounds assumptions and encourages a long, careful look. You may see a flower or a skull across the room, but there's something confounding about that composition that pulls us in. Then there's a careful selection of canvas textures that reliably facilitate a variety of brush and palette techniques to move the paint around and to give specific kinds of textures. There's simple contour underdrawing of the most compelling primary forms and negative spaces within a composition. And there are these beautiful, slightly lifted edges precisely above the underdrawn lines in smooth, nearly continuous brushstrokes that form raised edges of paint at the edges of the form. There's intentional control of paint textures. So I invite all of you, when you go to see the exhibition for the second and third time perhaps, get close to those paintings and examine closely the textures of each part of that composition. They are intentional. There's short scrubbing brushwork. There is long serpentine lines of brushwork. There is palette knife work that smooths the surface almost like cake frosting. Those are all intentional. There's an interesting characteristic in O'Keeffe's work in that she generally limits the composition to 3 or 4 colors only. She's using 3 or 4 tubes of different colors of paint. And finally, she's mixing only 3 or 4 shades of those colors in each individual work. So after you learn these, you won't need the images that I'm going to show you using infrared and ultraviolet. You'll be able to look at the work and begin to see exactly these characteristics in the gallery. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you these scientific images just to sort of key you in on how you can find them and discover them. So let's first consider these 2 works, both in the exhibition here in San Diego, juxtaposed to Henry Moore's own exploration of abstraction. On the right, Series 1, White and Blue Flower Shapes, 1919. This is an oil on board. It's about 20 inches by 16 inches. And on the left, Blue Line, 1919, an oil on canvas, roughly the same size, 20 by... Oh, goodness. Use the clicker. Thank you. Did any of those advance? Oh, good heavens, I'm so sorry. So these are beautiful transitions. Here are the 3 paintings we're going to be looking at in some detail today. The selection of the most compelling forms, the elimination of unnecessary detail, a composition that confounds quick looking, careful selection of canvas textures, simple contour underdrawing outlining the most compelling forms and negative spaces, slightly raised and lifted edges of paint precisely above the underdrawn lines, intentional control of paint textures from stiff to smooth, and generally limiting the composition to 3 or 4 colors, and then 3 or 4 values of each of those colors. So a very simple palette. Thank you for the technical assistance in the back. Right. So let's start off with blue line and Series 1 white and blue flower shapes on the right. So we can see the subject on the right as a distilled and flattened flower shape. It's almost rhythmic in its composition of the flower forms. But we can't see all the flower, right? We can't see if the flower is in a vase. We can't see if the flower is in the garden. We don't get the whole context. There's no narrative to be drawn here. And also the flower is missing a whole lot of detail that was probably there, texture in the flower, other details. And then there's this rather remarkable bright pink alizarin background. And where is that? Where does that come from? So O'Keeffe has extracted and recomposed the flower with some of the selection and elimination and emphasis that we've been talking about here. There's the selection of just the most compelling forms, the elimination of a great deal of detail, the emphasis of almost symmetrical parts on the right and left, centered around a vertical element, and the distilled colors down to just white, blue, green, and that alizarin crimson. So, I'm advancing 2 things at once. What about the painting on the left? Can we readily identify this as a flower form? The title gives us no help, and the sense of the volume-filled, layered flower pastels is now simplified as a series of modulated green, gray, and blue, and magenta colors at the bottom, and the blue sky is the blue line in the middle loosely bifurcates the space and becomes the point of focus. In this work that immediately follows the composition of Series 1 on the right, O'Keeffe decided to crop and simplify the entire composition. She selected and emphasized forms at the base of the flower. So what I'm saying is that if we let's see if the pointer works. Here we are. So if we look at just the base of the first work, Series 1, white and blue, and if we focus just on that, what we see is this form, and you can see how it relates immediately to the work that followed it. She simplifies, she focuses on one area, she eliminates detail, and she emphasizes the forms using color. This is a close-up of this exact area, and the image on the right is a transmitted infrared image. So infrared is the zone that's just beyond the human range of sight, so we don't see any color. What we see is simply a black and white image, and we're putting the source of infrared light behind the painting, so we're seeing how much infrared light comes through the painting towards the camera. So things that absorb infrared light are going to appear dark. Things that transmit and are translucent to infrared light are going to look whiter. So what we can see is O'Keeffe's careful underdrawing. O'Keeffe's careful underdrawing in charcoal, because carbon absorbs infrared light, that's why we have global warming, is shown as these dark outlines right at the edge of each form. That's the charcoal underdrawing. Can everybody see those? Maybe a little faint from the back of the room. The other thing you can see is, of course, the canvas texture. The canvas is made of linen. Linen is made of carbon, and so it likewise absorbs the infrared light. So we see this rough, beautiful, open weave of this canvas that's designed to grab and hold paint in a very particular way. It allows O'Keeffe to create texture like short scrubbing brushworks in her work. Look at this, I'm doing it two-fisted. I'm so proud of myself. Okay, Same artwork, but a different type of image. So in this image, what we've got is infrared light, but this is reflected infrared light. So instead of shooting the infrared light from the back of the canvas, we're going at the front of the design surface. And what we're able to see here is the beginning of a technique that O'Keeffe will use for the rest of her 60-year painting career, and that is painting what's called wet into dry. It's a technique that's very similar to using pastel. In pastel, if you want a green form, you don't take a yellow stick of pastel and a blue stick of pastel and blend the two. It doesn't work. You just get a sort of gray color as the two pigments sort of mix and reflect light together. So O'Keeffe uses the same technique when she wants to shift from a dark green to a light green, or if she wants to shift from a dark blue to a light blue. She sets all the colors that she's going to use out on her glass palette and mixes them to exactly the shades and the modulation of light to dark that she wants to use in the painting. So she has a complete color conception of what the work will require as she's setting it up, looking at the underdrawing. And then she applies each color where it needs to be. So she generally applies a middle value, say a middle value of green or a middle value of blue, and then applies, after that's set up so that it can't be blended, she applies the next lighter color adjacent to that and the next lighter color adjacent to that. What the infrared image on the right shows us that you can begin to see are the actual brush strokes where this technique, wet into dry, is applied. So you can see the squared off brush strokes. The infrared is showing us different mixtures of paint because they absorb and reflect infrared light differently. So if we look carefully, we can see squared off brushstrokes in this area, which equates to the squared off brushstroke of this very light gray right in here. We can see the squared off brushstrokes where they start and end on the far right, and this, of course, equates to the green adjacent to the gray here. So we begin to see O'Keeffe using this technique to advantage. By not blending the colors on the canvas, she keeps the final result, the final visual result, of shifts in color and shifts in value from dark to light, incredibly sharp. And when you look at any O'Keeffe painting throughout her entire 60-year career, if you look at a transition from a dark blue to light blue, look closely, and you will see each of these brushstrokes in transition, one adjacent to the other, as if it's pastel. There we go. Okay, abstraction, White Rose 1927, a larger canvas in this exhibition, 36 vertical by 30 horizontal, again, oil on canvas. And again, we're looking at a transmitted infrared light image. So the infrared light's behind the painting, and we're seeing how and why it comes through. And what we're going to be looking at here is a technique that O'Keeffe is unique within all the painters of the Stieglitz circle and unique to most modern painters. And that is that between the forms, so between the leaf forms, between the background and a subject, O'Keeffe does not overlap the paints. In fact, she leaves a gap of unpainted canvas between adjacent forms, what conservators refer to as a holiday, an area where there is no paint, deliberately put there by the artist. And frequently, when you look at the holidays between the forms in an O'Keeffe painting, you'll see little streaks of gray. And those little streaks of gray are the traces of the charcoal underdrawing immediately adjacent to those forms. And so we can see that in this infrared. So this is a close-up of the center of this painting. So we're looking at this area right in here, enlarged. And of course, you can see the underdrawing. We can see the charcoal line at the edges of these forms. But notice right here, a brighter white area, and particularly along this top form, see the bright line that's there adjacent to the charcoal. That's an area of unpainted canvas that you can see when you go look at this work in the gallery. There are the holidays between these forms. This is a technique that's used by Japanese woodblock printers and in ancient Chinese scroll paintings. And it's a technique so that the inks and the paints and the printing inks don't run into each other and obviously destroy the color. They don't blend and they don't blur. But O'Keeffe is using this ancient technique to a new advantage. She's creating a visual border, literally a physical raised border and a valley in very small, minute ways, so that it will catch your eye in a very subliminal way and move your eye across the edges of the form, creating a visual rhythm to each painting. You will move as if you're looking at a moor and looking at the edges of the mass. You'll be looking at the edges of O'Keeffe's forms because there are these beautiful valleys. Now, this is a different kind of image of our painting Abstraction White Rose. On the left is exactly how it looks in the gallery, but on the right, we are looking at what's called an ultraviolet-induced luminescence image. Now, that's a fancy way of saying that we're putting a black light of one wavelength, 365 nanometers, and that wavelength happens to excite linseed oil. So if we were just looking at linseed oil, we'd see a bright yellow glow coming off the painting. But because the linseed oil has pigment mixed in it, the bright yellow glow is bouncing and scattering off the pigment particles in O'Keeffe's paint to give us what we see. So this painting is literally glowing in the dark, as you see it here on the right. So what it allows me to do is to see each time O'Keeffe changes her paint mixture to add a new pigment. And so this is brilliant. We can see that there are 4 different shades of black, there are 3 different shades of white, 3 different shades of green, but there's also a really subtle technique that you would only see, I think, if you really looked carefully at this work. We see, all of you can perhaps see, this tinge of sort of gold color in the lower left, again in the upper right, right in here, sort of just below the midpoint to the right, and a little trace of it right here in the center. This is where O'Keeffe adds the smallest amount of yellow ochre, to warm that gray tone just slightly, to warm it, to bring it forward slightly, to increase the abstraction of the composition. And so in ultraviolet light, we begin to see O'Keeffe changing her paints, mixing her paints, and including very subtle elements that are only going to reward someone who takes time and looks at the colors carefully. What's going to happen? Yeah. Okay, now we've zoomed in on the middle of that painting. So we're in the middle. This is a normal light image right here on the left. This is exactly how it appears in the gallery. But the image on the right is now a reflected ultraviolet light. So unlike ultraviolet-induced luminescence, where the painting is glowing, I've put a new camera with a new filter in front of it, and now I'm just looking at how much ultraviolet light is reflected, and that looks white, and how much ultraviolet light is being absorbed, and those look gray and black. And what this again does is it points out each different paint mixture that O'Keeffe applies. And what we see when we look at the reflected ultraviolet is, of course, her brushwork and these really subtle changes that O'Keeffe uses in mixing her whites. So I'll point some of these out. So if we look at sort of the brightest whites in this area, so right here in this little arc on the left, near the top of the painting, we can see a very bright white, and that corresponds nicely to the brightest white in the reflected ultraviolet. But if you look at what looks to be largely white areas of this painting, you'll see that there are various shades of gray, various shades of bright white, medium white, dark white. And that's O'Keeffe modulating what seems to be, at first glance, a monochromatic application of paint that's pure white. But she is absolutely conscious that she is applying depth of color, depth of shade, changes in translucency and opacity to, again, create a rhythmic experience for the careful viewer. Okay, so let's see if we can put together everything I've talked about so far with the technical problems I had in the beginning, but hopefully we've all learned something. So let's see if we can take another painting and put it all together. This is Ram's Head, Blue Morning Glory, 1938. It is an oil on canvas. It's roughly 20 inches vertical, 30 inches horizontal. And again, I've chosen this because A, it is the first work you see walking into this exhibition, so it'll be the first experience that you're going to have. Also because the background appears at first glance to be utterly monochromatic and without depth and without modulation, sort of highlighting this beautiful ram skull with the blue morning glory. And we can see the glorious translucent cobalt blue in the morning glory and the modulation of color in the skull. But there's more here to see for the careful viewer. Let's look at it in raking light to look at the paint textures that O'Keeffe has put before us. So here the light is from above, almost parallel to the surface of the painting. And there are a few things that are really clear, the first of which are the raised ridges of paint that O'Keeffe is using at the edges of the form. So if we look at the edge of the ram skull and the eye socket, and the edge over here, and if we look at the edge of the horns, you can see that raised ridge of paint. You can also see how O'Keeffe is modulating the texture with a palette knife, so she is smoothing it in some areas. And you can also see the short scrubbing brushwork that she's using in the brightest area of the skull. That's called, that texture, that scrubbing brush texture, scatters the light. When it reflects in all directions. And the net effect of that most oil painters know, is it will bring that part of the form forward to the viewer. So she's brought the brightest part of the skull forward to us, and she's moved by using the palette knife, the background back. But there's more of a reward here than just looking at the paint texture she's provided us with. Now, this is our ultraviolet-induced visible luminescence. So the painting is glowing, visible light. It's yellow light in the linseed oil that's reacting with different paint mixtures that O'Keeffe has applied. And we can see some wonderful, wonderful mixes. Now, one thing is that the matte yellow ochre horns you see are extremely uniform. There's no modulation in that color. She has made them absolutely flat. She's removed all detail of texture in those horns. She's simplified these two horns to be this beautiful diagonal serpentine line within this rectangular space on either side of the central axis of the painting. So she's created a visual rhythm that literally brings you down into the skull. But in the skull, we can see, again, lead white in its purest form is the brightest paint. And then we can see her adding bone black to create a series of grays to suggest the shadows that she's seeing in the skull. But let's look at this monochromatic white background. As I said, in UV-induced luminescence, every mixture of paint, every time a new pigment is added to that white paint, there will be a shift in the color of the light that's being illuminated under UV light. And you can see, looking at this, that there are many, many colors of white within this monochromatic background. O'Keeffe has added some cobalt blue to cool the shadows under the horns. She has added some beautiful alizarin crimson pink color into a number of the shadows to give them a warmer tone. You can see in the middle, right here at sort of the nose of the skull, she's added a tiny bit of yellow ochre to warm that area up to make it more inviting visually. So O'Keeffe has quite intentionally mixed all the whites, things that from a distance look like one white, again to reward the viewer who's willing to spend time and enter into a conversation with this painting. And a final view here, of course, as it appears in the gallery on the left, but this is our old friend, the transmitted infrared image where we're shining infrared light from the back of the piece, and we can see all the things we've sort of talked about quite clearly. If you look at the edge of the horns coming down to the edge of the eye socket, on both sides you see that bright white line. That's the holiday where the two paints from the background and the subject don't meet. That's the gap of unpainted canvas where you will see some charcoal underdrawing. We can see O'Keeffe's use of charcoal to create the shadows, and we can also see the raised ridges of paint as slightly dark lines immediately adjacent to those white holidays. So we can see her simplifying, we can see her modulating texture and color, we can see her using different textures of paints, different opacity, all to create an intentional conversation, not to tell a story, not to create one narrative of what a painting is about or what you should see. She has no intention of telling you a story. In fact, O'Keeffe's compositions, I think, are all about confounding that presumption of narrative. She doesn't want to tell you anything. She wants you to ask questions about how we all see very normal, very conventional things, and within that, how we discover brand new images. So with that, I'll leave you with her ideas, placed as simply as they could be. To see takes time, so please look closer. Thank you.